Hey guys, welcome back to Tech Insights with Dylan White. It's Friday. It's been a long week and definitely got some late studying to do. So, for those that haven't been around for the journey, I've been over the last 2.5, 3 weeks, ever since a little bit before Microsoft Ignite, I've been studying for the AZ500 exam, and I actually went through and said, I'm just going to schedule it. So, schedule it for really early Monday. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to go through and do a live study session. We're going to go through and look at a few of the videos on the AZ500 exam guide and walk through one of them. The first section is all about identity. So walk through probably part of that just to see what questions are on the exam, but also go through a little bit of the weekend review. And I kind of just want to get more content out there on YouTube, just get more comfortable talking. So hope you guys like it. Today we're going to talk about the weekend review and a little bit about the concept that's been around on social media for a while now, which is what your first job should be in tech, right? Especially if you're transitioning, whatever. So first off, your first job in tech should always be really what you want to make it. Because I backed myself to have a help desk role for 6 months to 9 months and said, after 6 months, I should be able to get a job anywhere if I just position it the right way and take everything I learned and document it. That's what I did. And so I took a help desk role making $45K back in 2016 and transitioned to making $75K as basically an endpoint engineer for security engineer, right? For one of the big three up in Detroit and one of the big three automakers. It was awesome. So I went from doing everything for a managed service provider, Microsoft, VMware, Veeam, backups, configuring, shared files, shared drives, right, mapping drives, end user support, working at, senior care centers and doing on-site stuff, working as a visa. Like I did all of it when I was at area help desk. And at a small managed service provider, you have so many capabilities to do that. So that's kind of why I drive a lot of people I talk to that are looking for their first job in tech to go look, right? And I would say every city that is in the United States, at least, has managed service providers in their city, right? Even the small town I live in has 2 managed service providers. So you can easily look for a role, whether it's paying, $17, $23 an hour to start. That might be what it pays, right? But what you can do is you can take all the opportunities they give you to learn new technology. So it's all on you when it comes to a new career. So I think help desk isn't a terrible place to start. But I also think that if you come from a background of finance or auditing, insurance, anything like that, it's a pretty easy transition into what they call governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. That's a pretty easy space as well. So one thing that we'll dive into after I talk about this a little bit is we'll dive into how to find a help desk role, right? I think a lot of people struggle with just finding your first help desk role. And I help people do it all the time, just drop it in roles. I kind of quit doing it for a while just because the study and kind of work just kind of went crazy for a while. So now that it's December, just kind of want to get back into a good stride for the next 25 days before Christmas. So let's dive in real quick. All right, so we'll dive in the AZ500 in a second. But so help desk role, I'm gonna pick a random city in the United States. I'm an East Coast person. Let's go somewhere in Georgia. Let's go Savannah. I like Savannah, Georgia a lot. So we'll just type Savannah, Georgia, managed service provider. Okay. So when you look at managed service providers, basically what they provide is managed services to small and medium-sized businesses in the area. All right, so we got complete network and some E2. So let's take a look. Basically, all you do is you click it and see what the website's got to offer. Complete.network. So let's see, careers. Let's see what they got. Be part of the team. So they're actually headquartered in 4 different locations. They have positions in Charlotte. They have positions in Bluffton, Albany, New York. So the service desk initiative deployment technician are probably the 2 I would look at. In particular, let's see. So service desk technician in Bluffton, South Carolina. They're looking for good personality. They're looking for organized, lots of AD, desktop server, AV, malware support, skills and certs, Windows Server, Microsoft Exchange, Linux, VMware, SQL, overtime and be on call. They deliver first-year IT support to one of the Tech Valley's top companies. So I don't see anything that jumps on me as crazy. They just want someone that's level 1, level 2 desktop. And be doing it all. So very small team is my guess. They support probably different size companies. So you're going to do everything from networking to server support to user support. So there's jobs out there. Deployment technician, pretty sure it's probably something to do with Intune. Associate bachelor's, level 1 or 2 support. You're doing, it's the same job description. So usually as a deployment technician, you're going to be building and imaging machines for new users as they start their new jobs. Pretty straightforward. Some companies use Intune. Some companies use a service called SCCM, which is System Center Manager, I think. I can't remember what it is. But it's a Microsoft product, and then other tools are used also for that. So there's what's called WSUBs from Windows, for Pixie Boots, all kinds of stuff. But the deployment technician is also very low level, but it's an easy way to transition into what would be a desktop support or endpoint job, right? You can transition to networking and cybersecurity from there. So lots of ways to grow from that. Let's look at one of those other ones that popped up. System Meets, you've never heard of them either, but right. They do manage IT, manage security, internet voice infrastructure. They're very small. My guess is they're probably 1 or 2 people, and it's probably that's not for sure. Yeah, no idea. No jobs on there, so let's see if we can find one more good city before we go study for this test. So we did Savannah. Let's do Memphis. So Memphis, I can spell. Let's see website. Technology, so they do healthcare IT. So they got support desk, systems admin, and systems engineer. Tier 1 IT support, be first contact. Why 2.0 years is IT support. Direct user support is required. Ability to resolve 10 and 20 tickets a day. And be available for on-call. Microsoft operating system servers. Just like the last job, they want certs. So Azure AD and PM, and so you're gonna learn a lot. And probably Microsoft partner and sell their services to them. So my guess is either one of these would be pretty easy to break into. So if you're in Memphis, the way I look at this is see if usually MSPs have an about us page with different people that work there, and they don't though. Usually they have a team page. So you try to find one of them. Since they don't, you can usually just look them up on LinkedIn, type in PCS Managed Services. should pop up. I'll drop all these companies that we looked up though in the chat. So now that's done. Let's hop in and see if we can start studying. So before I dive deep into this, Azure studies, I'd like to talk about just a week in the life of a sales engineer. So obviously last week was Thanksgiving, so the Thanksgiving week was pretty quiet, but basically people packed the schedule. For those that don't know what a sales engineer is, or a solutions architect, and when it comes to pre-sales, there's three different real departments per se inside of what's called a solutions integrator or value-added reseller. So think CDWs, SHIs. That's kind of the place I work, right? So the place I work, we sell services and we sell products. So I work in the Microsoft team, and I do all the work before the solutions are sold, right? So I design and develop the documentation for the projects that we're going to do, but also for creating different products, whether we can make baselines and do quicker deployments, demonstrations, lots of customer calls. And then in professional services world, that's where you're doing all the deployment work, right? You're doing the actual job. And then there's also what's called the managed services side. So three different sides, usually to solutions integrator. So I work actually on all three of them. My first job was help desk for a managed service provider. For the company I work for now, I was on the professional services side, doing all the different projects. And now I work in the pre-sale side, just doing Microsoft security. So I support products like Microsoft Defender, Microsoft Sentinel, Microsoft Entra, Microsoft anything, but Microsoft Purview, Azure, anything that says Azure Defender, Azure Purview, all stuff that I support. So that being said, that's why I'm taking this lovely test. So let's dive in. So in the last couple of weeks, you've seen me kind of go through each one of these phases. We talked about identity, we talked about data, application networks. But in every Microsoft exam, they now include this green section. Super important to look at the first two bullets. Every test will have prep videos, and every test will have a study guide. So the study guide will actually have the bulleted list out of what should be on the test. The prep videos will have it broken down by domain. So if you look, right, there's 4 different videos on here. They also have broken down into, what the skills measured percentages are going to be, which is, identity, networking, compute storage and databases, and SecOps. So identity, I'm pretty solid at. I'll probably go back just to get a refresher. But networking and compute storage are the ones I definitely want to focus on. So I'm going to look at secure networking. Let's take a look. So plan and implement security for virtual networks, plan and implement security for private access, plan and implement security for public access.
Welcome back. My name is Matt Hester, Microsoft trainer at Microsoft. This is our second functional group on secure networking in the exam prep video series, AZ500 Microsoft Security Technologies. So after identity, welcome to functional group 2. It's secure networking. So we have the IDs. Now we have the networking as we come into this. And so we're going to talk about virtual networks. We're going to talk about private access.
So as I watch this video, I'll also talk through bits and pieces of it. So
resources, public access to resources, and kind of a little bit of everything in between. This is not a complete list of the things that you'll see, obviously, but let's hop right in with security. From a standpoint, probably one of the most important things you're going to want to know the concept of is a security group or an NSG, and how they relate to what is called an application security group. So now before I talk about the ASGs, or the application security groups, let me talk about the network security groups for a second. The network security group is what you want to know about what it is. It works at layer 4, so it's a packet filter. Now, it's very fine grained, but when you break down what an NSG does, it's pretty simple. Is who are you? Where are you trying to go? Source and destination. And am I going to allow you or deny you? That's all the NSG does. Looks at your source and destination and allows you or denies you based on that. Okay, that's all it does at a packet filtering level. Now, when you take your exam, know the priority order matters, the rules of what priority they in. And the simplest way to remember that, the first rule rules. In other words, the lowest priority number will always be checked before the higher priority numbers. And by the way, as another tip for you for the exam, there's one last rule. There's actually 3 rules you cannot change. They're the default rules that govern inbound, outbound communication for some of the network. But really, the last rule is the most important one. The last rule is deny all. So if you're anybody going to anywhere, it's a deny rule. So the cool thing about NSGs, you're making exceptions to that last rule because by default, NSGs lock down your environment. Okay, so know where they fit in. And then we have this thing called application security groups, or ASGs. ASGs are designed as a bucket. That's all they really are. They're designed to have a bucket of virtual network interface cards inside of that. They exist for the sole reason to make rules inside of NSGs. Because if you imagine you have a load balancing set where you're increasing the servers, well, I may not always know the IP address of all those systems that are getting spun up dynamically by Azure, but with an ASG, I can stick them inside there and still maintain security. So they go hand in hand. But an ASG really exists for the sole purpose of being a part of the network security group and the rules that we process. Keep that straight for your exams. From a real life perspective, folks, when you pass the exam, that's great. Know how to use this in real life. It's going to keep you locked down and safe and secure. Know what user-defined routes from an.
This question I've gotten on every single one of these tests. So also for those that have not followed this journey. I've taken this test probably 1 too many times to say out loud. Taken this test and failed it 5 times. So this will be my 6th try. I hate this test. So on every single one of them, though, I've had the user-defined routes on my test.
Networking perspective. So how do we get from point A to point B in Azure? Understand Azure will always create what is known as a system route. That sits under the covers. Azure creates it. It manages it, maintains that. But what you can do is create a user-defined route on top of that. It supersedes the system route. So whatever we put in the user-defined routes will always rule. It's our way to manage how the traffic flows from one location to another inside of Azure. Azure's job is to get you from point A to point B as quick as it can, but you may need to route traffic somewhere else. You're going to use user-defined routes to make that happen inside of Azure. Know what they are, know how you can set them up, how we work with the different hops as we move from one network to another network inside of Azure. Understand that in our environment. Then we have how do we connect our networks. We have virtual network peering and global peering. And all global is a fancy way of saying I'm peering networks between regions. So if I have a network in East region or a network in the West region, it's called global peering. It's the same thing as peering inside of Azure. Now, the reason they put this on the slide with or VPN gateway that we have on the environment that we work with. Now that we know how we route routes between our environment, how do we actually connect them? And that's with what is called peering. Peering is a way that we commonly connect virtual networks inside of Azure. We know the difference between virtual network peer and global. By the way, quick thing here, global means there's more than one region. So if I'm peering all the networks inside of an East region, just virtual network peering. If I'm peering an East network region to a West network region, that's called global peering. So, and there's some limitations to that, but for the most part, folks, a peer is a peer. Now, on this slide, you'll notice they have these keywords at the very top, and it's worth kind of highlighting here, or VPN gateway. Well, why is this important? Well, peering is newer than VPN gateways. So when I first used Azure, and some of you might be along with me, the way we connected networks together in Azure initially were with VPN gateways, which now are traditionally designed for on-prem kind of connectivity into our Azure environment. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But we could still use that to connect. Know the difference between what a peer provides versus a VPN gateway. There are 2 big things, in my opinion, and really functionally and technically. First off, peering is faster to set up. You can connect 2 virtual networks in about a minute or 2, depending on where the networks happen to be located in Azure. VPN gateway will take about 45 minutes to set up. So administratively, peering is a little bit easier. VPN gateways provide one additional thing that peering does not, and it's very important you understand this. Peering is a private connection between 2 virtual networks that you manage and maintain. So Azure itself and the physical framework under the covers of everything keeps that network private for you and for you alone. VPN gateway encrypts it. So you have a private network versus an encrypted network. So if you actually have an additional compliance, I need to have an encrypted channel between my networks. VPN gateway will always be the answer because peering doesn't do that. Now, it doesn't mean encrypted traffic doesn't flow over peering. It just means it has to be done at the application layer to do that. So know those subtle difference. Peering is faster. VPN gateway offers encryption. But in real life, folks, I see a lot more peering because of the nature of the private networks, and they meet even government compliances with this. So exam testing point for you on that one, just to understand the difference between the two. We also have a new concept called a virtual WAN of how we set this up. For your exam, know this at a very high level of how we connect resources in Azure. And really the nice thing about this, when we're connected from a security standpoint, we support IPsec or IKE, IKE v1 or IKE v2 for that actual connectivity in that secure fashion from those VPNs. And so know the process at a real high level, what it's offering from a security standpoint. But we have a thing called a secured hub. It looks very similar to set up to a VPN gateway, but it's much, much, much faster. And what we're going on into Azure. So architecturally, something that's kind of out of the scope of the exam. When you move down the road in your journey, get into 305 or some of the networking, you're going to get really buried in those virtual WAN classes. It's actually quite exciting technology that we have.
If by exciting, it means very, very meh. That's exciting. Networking is definitely the subject I hate the most. But I would say it's definitely all over the test. Definitely know how to do what he's talking about here with the virtual WAN, this process itself right here for how to create a virtual WAN, what you can do with it, right? Super important.
Now, what about connecting from on-prem? How do we connect on-prem inside of Azure? Well, if you watched video one, we talked about AD application proxy, but how does it travel across our environment? How do we connect to it? You can use things like a site-to-site VPN, or you can include ExpressRoute if you have that connectivity as well, or even a point-to-site VPN if it's a specific type of app, like imagine maybe just a user management app of a VM that's on a network. You could use a point-to-site VM. Know the difference between those two environments. Know that we have some partners that will help you work with this as well. The nice thing about some of these partners are like Kemp and Strata, they support conditional access as a part of that authentication process. So when those on-prem apps are coming into Azure, we have the ability to authenticate and look at those credentials to make sure they're safe and secure. For the exam, know kind of the difference between point-to-site and site-to-site, especially when it comes to how we work with authentication resources inside of Azure as well. Know that we have a firewall in Azure. As you might imagine, it's one of our PaaS resources, how we can set up our environment. But know we also have a web application firewall, which is slightly different. The web application firewall looks at the OWASP top 10. The Azure firewall is a traditional layer 7 application filterer. There are lots of options and lots of third-party offerings for firewalls to choose from. Know kind of our Azure firewall at a fairly high level inside of it. Know that ExpressRoute can affect how that firewall works. We can terminate it outside the firewall, or we can terminate it inside the firewall, which is the default recommendation for how we integrate with the on-prem networks. ExpressRoute, for those of you not familiar, is a direct private connection from on-prem into Azure. It's different when you compare it to site-to-site VPN or VPN, or point-to-site VPN. Both the VPN choices know that they go over the internet. They go over the public internet. That's why they're fully encrypted channels. ExpressRoute is a direct line right into the Azure security services. And actually, I need to correct myself just a bit. It's into the Microsoft Cloud services. Customers that have ExpressRoute can use that not only for Azure, but there's also potential they can use it for, as an example, their Microsoft 365 subscriptions as well. So it has that additional capability from a networking standpoint. All right. So know how we connect, how we have that on-prem connectivity inside of Azure. Now, how do we monitor a lot of this stuff?
This was definitely one question that will pop up not only in practice assessments, but you'll see it inside the study guide network launcher. So understanding this, what it is, how network launcher flows, map, is important.
First off, you have one of the greatest tools from a real life perspective that I've seen for monitoring. We have a thing called Network Watcher. Know what it can do. Network Watcher is basically our monitoring tool designed to look just at networks. It can monitor your VPN traffic. It can even do packet sniffing. It can look at connectivity with things like called Nexthop, which is equivalent to Traceroute for those of you who might be a little old school. We also have a connectivity test, very similar to what we have with Ping, but we can also look at the NSD flow logs. So whenever you think about an application, when it's trying to connect to another application, there could be a network security group rule that's preventing that communication. Well, it's going to show you that flow log and show you what rules are passing based on the parameters you specify it. It also does a really neat topology map, understand what network monitoring does, especially how it relates to network security groups. So how do we verify if something's the network or if it's something wrong with the app? NSG, the network NSG flow logging that's in the network watcher is a great way to look at that as well inside of Azure. So some really powerful technologies that we have the ability to work with inside of our environments, right? Then we come to endpoints. So we talked about resource to resource access. In Azure, if you have peered networks together and applications on network one, it can go over the peer to a resource in network B, like maybe a database as an example. Well, service endpoints are a better way to potentially do that. First off, service endpoints that we have, and we have, by the way, we have two types of endpoints. We have service endpoints, which we'll talk about here, and we have private endpoints, which we'll talk about next. But service endpoints essentially make a service a known kind of entity on a network. It's known mainly to the virtual network, but also to Azure. The cool thing about endpoints, whether it's a service endpoint or a private endpoint, they travel directly over the Azure backbone. So if you imagine you have a resource in VNet 1 wants to talk to a resource in VNet 2, it can travel over that service endpoint. The main difference between service endpoint and what I'll talk about next with private endpoint, a service means the entire Azure service. You want to keep that straight. So let's say I make a service endpoint for Azure SQL, and I have 20 instances of Azure SQL behind that service endpoint. They're all accessible via that one service endpoint, which could provide some great functionality, but it's all the instances. You can use a thing called a service endpoint policy to control that. Know that as well for your exam. But if you want to lock down just a single instance of a service that lives on a virtual network, you can create the other option here, which is called a private endpoint. And a private endpoint actually makes a private connection. In reality, let's say I make a private endpoint for SQL again. It actually will give that SQL database a private IP address on the virtual network it lives, and we connect that private endpoint over a thing called private link. So oftentimes people get private link and private endpoint kind of confused. They actually are partners. You have to have a private endpoint, and when you say, I want to connect to the private endpoint, Azure says, I know how to do that, and it goes over the private link to actually connect you to the resource. So our apps and our resources will talk to the private endpoint. The actual connectivity happens with private link. Know that for your exam. It's a great way we can integrate with on-prem apps and peered networks. One last very important point about endpoints. Service points and private endpoints, they also share one really big thing in common. The great thing about the endpoints, whenever you create them, they block public internet access direct into that resource. In other words, you have to be somewhere inside of Azure to get to the resource. There is no direct connectivity from outside of Azure. Both endpoints do that. It's a really nice way to keep our services safe and secure. And from an application design standpoint, folks, you're going to want to use endpoints for the simple fact it travels directly over the Azure backbone. It's a much more efficient way, fast way to connect our resources inside of Azure. I talk about private link, even though it seems like they're kind of set up together, you do have to set up private endpoint or private link a little separately. You're going to want to know the steps of how to set this up, especially if you're coming in from like, and this particular example talks about
know this with back in hand. So on Microsoft exams, whether it's the AZ500, any exam, they're going to have what they call lab environments, but they're also going to have basically select this process question, right? So how do you do something, right? What's the first step in the process, right? Etc. So
a load balancer, it's going to set those configurations up. So you do have to configure that private link to that private endpoint and set up the services for your exam. Know those steps of how we configure, create the service, create the service ID, create that actual private endpoint, and then approve or reject those requests. So the cool thing about this is that we have some even security inside of it to leverage those different areas. Functionally as well, you still have network security groups involved here. So we still have to go through those NSGs to make it work inside of Azure. Okay. We also have a thing called Azure App Services in our environment that allows us to work with those separate app services from an environment of how we work with it. How do we actually connect to those virtual environments? You can use a gateway required virtual network integration component, or you can just use virtual regional network integrations. In other words, we can connect to the different virtual networks in the same region by using dedicated subnets and virtual networks. So depending on where your application resources are located, you're probably going to use gateway services. Know the difference between virtual network integration, gateway integration, and regional integration, some of the limits and possibilities there. When you think about region, really it's locked down to a single region. If you see on the slide, it kind of gives you the key hint right here. Regional network integration, which is right here. Okay, what is that referred to? That means they are in the same region right here versus gateway. Notice the key phrase up here, other regions. For your exam, keep them straight. Just memorize that. And the exam questions will be pretty straightforward how they will look in that particular area. Okay. Now, application service environments. Now, this is pretty exciting. There's a lot of components here to make this work. But when we look at application service environments, we really talk about how do we give actual IP addresses. So we can actually get dedicated IP addresses for that app, either private addresses, or I should say private addresses and or public, depending on where the app is. We can do scaling with the worker roles. We can have app access defined by domain suffixes, depending on what we need to do. Know some of the nuances here. In this exam, there are some security considerations, but they want you to make sure you know what those are, because when we're doing this, we're opening up a potential another area that we're going to have to lock down with NSGs, how we work with that. So know some of the nuances of the application service environment for your actual exams inside of Azure. Okay, so know how those work, know how they're set up, and how we can leverage them for our environment. All right. Now, we also have Azure Security for SQL. And this is SQL, and they use managed instance here, but we have different layers to actually implement this. Know how we can implement security for internal traffic, how we private networks, how we establish resources. And really the nice thing for SQL managed instance, we have a little bit more control over that actual instance of security to make sure it's set up. And even how we can set up secure domain name services or domain name resolution. So when you're implementing this, we can have a baseline of what this looks like from a SQL managed instance when it's existing on our network inside of Azure. Things like Azure SQL already have this built in. It's part of its DNA. When you get a managed instance, this is part of that managed instance part. You do have to manage some of those connectivities a little differently inside of Azure. All right. Whenever we think about Azure apps and we start thinking about apps going across our network inside of our environment, we want to really be careful with the different areas that we get into here. Specifically, when we talk about app service environments here, we want to talk about API management as well as how do we set up TLS. A lot of our applications, things like SQL as an example, support TLS. Our web services, they're kind of built in that give us the ability for strong authentication, privacy, integrity, flexibility with what algorithms we use under the covers for encrypting that traffic. It's pretty easy to deploy. In most cases, it's a checkbox. So know that. It's also give us interoperability. So all 6 of those things on this slide is something you want to know about what it does for applications for app service and API management. API management helps solve one of my favorite terms in all technology. It's called shadow IT. And I always smile when I hear that, but understand if you have developers in your environment, they're going to be using those different technologies and those APIs. API management allows you to control that, know what it does. Because now I can say to list developers, you can use certain things, but that's it inside the environment for us to use and leverage. All right. Azure Firewall. The nice thing.
Definitely pay attention to this one. It's all over the study guide.
About the exam, we don't really dig into the actual policies. So you don't have to know like the nitty gritty of the individual policies, but know at a high level what Azure Firewall does, including what is known as Firewall Manager and the firewall policies themselves. And I'll talk a bit about those. I'll spend a minute on this slide as we go through it. With Azure Firewall, when you think about it, it's a layer 7 firewall. It's based on Palo Alto technologies. It's based on a lot of the same kind of things that we use today. But we have a thing called Firewall Manager. The great thing about this, if you have a bunch of firewalls that you want to manage centrally, you can use Azure Firewall Manager not only to manage them, but also deploy the Azure Firewall policies. We can make policies for application, for network traffic, for FQDN tags, pretty much the standard kind of things that we can do. We can even use a thing called force tunneling in our environments as well. So when traffic comes in, firewall analyzes it, force tunneling, we can send it to on-prem.
All right. I'm going to leave off here for the night and dive back in the morning to more networking. But I want to do a little bit of a demo. So let's see on the study guide from a network perspective that we can dive into. All right, so if we go back, we go to the study guide. Let's see what's on the networking page. Let's see, what's this one entail? Plan, implement an Azure App Gateway. That's what I've seen on the study guides. So you can always take the questions. You can just hop right in. So it says to create and configure an application gateway that hosts multiple websites using the Azure portal. So you can basically define backend address pools using virtual machines and configure listeners and rules based on 2 domains to make sure web traffic arrives at the appropriate servers in the pools. And this tutorial is using Contoso and Fabricam. So in this tutorial, create an app gateway, create virtual machines for backend servers, create backend pools for the backend servers, and create listeners, routing rules, and edit hosts for name resolution. So let's see. And so if you walk through, you can actually see it in action, like how you create the app gateway, the virtual network, and then how you create the front ends. You see the routes that it's asking you to create. And the good thing about the labs, from a Microsoft perspective, is they actually give you all the information to put in there. Right? So all you should do for the back ends. How you can test it even, right? So you can install IIS or Information Services. Very long lasting service on Windows machines. Right, so you can go to Cloud Shell, PowerShell, and build IIS. I went over this briefly Tuesday, right? A lot of Microsoft now is using this PowerShell format, right, of how to deploy resources, right? This is the infrastructure as code. All right, so in here, right, setting the Azure VM extension, right, on this is directly on the virtual machine itself, right? So the resource group AG, extension name is IIS, VM name is Contoso VM, publisher is Microsoft Compute, extension type is a custom script, handler version, you're looking at the settings string, execute, add Windows feature, web server, PowerShell add content, path, pub, inet pub, www root, default HTML / values and environment computer name. It's very straightforward. And all you did was install Internet Information Services. And then from the front end, you can go and have to go do the back end. host file, for those that don't know what a host file is, I will drop a link to Google what a host file is. There's a couple good documents out there. This one itself is just a docs file, so you can see what is in the host file. You can see it's got, you can comment things out of the host file, what different pointers, etc. So then the great thing about it is it shows you how to clean up your resources so you don't get charged a crazy amount of money. So all very, very cool. I think for tomorrow I'll go in and actually go into one of my demo labs and we'll create it. We'll dive in. I'll probably create it both using PowerShell, using the Azure CLI, and also using just the Azure GUI. So you guys can see both.